Well, good afternoon. If I were to ask you to name a miracle of Jesus, I suspect that very few people would name the healing of the deaf man. And that's probably because only Mark's gospel records that particular miracle. But it seems to me if we forget Jesus restores hearing, we may forget really important things about speech. I'm interested in this particular miracle because I've been hearing impaired for most of my life. And in fact, the Baltimore Carmel recently prayed me through the installation of a prosthetic inner ear, if you can imagine it. So this marked miracle really delights me. But I might not be quite so enthused about what it suggests about listening and openness. So the evangelist Mark, I think, reveals what he wants us to know about Jesus, not so much by what Jesus says, but by what Jesus does. So Mark's gospel isn't Matthew or Luke or John with all those parables and discourses that Jesus gives in those gospels. In Mark's Jesus, it is the in Mark's gospel, it's the actions of Jesus that reveal the evangelist's Christology. And I think this miracle points directly to the messiahship of Jesus. And we know that because of the Isaiah text that is the first text tomorrow. Isaiah 35 helps us to understand what Mark is up to. The prophet in Isaiah 35 tomorrow is describing what will happen when the Messiah comes. Isaiah says the blind will see, the deaf will hear, the lame will jump around, the mute will sing. At the beginning of his ministry in Mark, Jesus heals a lame man. And here he heals deaf man. And in chapter 8, he's going to heal a blind man. So Mark is showing us the realization of what the prophet Isaiah prophesied. He shows us that Jesus of Nazareth is the one of whom the prophets spoke. And at the end of the text in Mark, we get a summary of the response of people to Jesus at this point, and it is they were astounded beyond measure. So the early people, the early hearers of the Gospel of Mark, or the early hearers of Jesus' speech, obviously made that connection between Isaiah and the person of Jesus. So I wonder if, though, they really intuited what Jesus' actions mean. I really hope that we do, because Mark's narrative suggests, I think, two very important things. One is about listening and what we do when our ears are open. And the second thing reminds us of something that our culture as a whole has, I think, forgotten: the connection between good hearing and good speech. The deaf can't hear, but those who can hear can be deafened by the noisiness of the world. The noise and the static in the world that you and I live in can deafen us to what we should hear. We live in a sound bombarded world. And I ask you, when during the day is there quietude for you to listen, unless you make it? I think that a lot of people actively try to avoid silence. And even when we pray, or at least when I pray, often I spend more time talking to God than I spend listening to God. And I realize how long a friendship would last if I only talked and never listened with a friend. So, Ephrathah, as he does at many important moments, Mark's gospel retains the Aramaic word of Jesus. And this is one of the reasons that scholars think that there was maybe Peter, but certainly an eyewitness to the teaching, to the activities of Jesus, that Mark had to write the gospel. Jesus commands, be opened. And it's a command to the opening of the whole person, I think. Be open so that you can hear with all of you, so that you can hear what is really crucial, what the writer of First Kings called the still small voice, or now, as it's often wondrously translated, the sound of sheer silence. Be opened, Jesus commands, so that you can hear the cries of the poor and the hungry and the dispossessed and the disadvantaged, the lonely, the bombed, the invaded. Be opened in your ears so that you can hear the cries of the world. Be opened, Jesus commands, so that you can hear me in them. To hear, we have to listen. Listening implies a degree of silence, as all the hard of hearing know. And to hear spiritually, we have actively to seek silence, to turn off some gadgets, maybe to cut out some of the background noise in life. Be open so that you can hear. And that brings us to the second thing I think is really important in this text in Mark. The miracle of the restoration of hearing is also a miracle of the restoration of speech. Mark's narrative directly connects hearing and speech. Verse 35 reads, "Immediately his ears were opened and his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly." Jesus makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. And because his ears are open, the man could speak plainly. It is, in fact, a physiological truth that hearing impairment, especially from birth, is often accompanied with speech defects. If you can't hear clearly, you can't speak clearly. What is physically true often speaks to us of spiritual truths. If our ears aren't open, how shall we hear life's more subtle sounds? How shall we hear the voice of God or the needs of others or our own deepest truths unless our ears and our whole selves are opened? Do you remember how often the prophets in Hebrew Bible begin the prophecies with "Listen" or "Hear, O Israel"? In the seed parables in Mark 4, which is earlier, which is early in the life of Jesus in Mark, the word "listen" appears repeatedly. And that series of parables closes, "Let anyone with ears to hear listen." I don't think those parables are about soil or seed. I think they're about listening and hearing. It's about hearing, not stuff. When Jesus says those who have more will be given, that's not problematic if the issue at hand is how we're listening. Now, I think it's an example of use it or lose it, if you want to put it in those terms. The more we listen toward God, the more we will be able to hear. Have you ever pondered the fact that God made us with 2 ears and 1 mouth? Do you suppose that might suggest that we should listen or maybe listen more than we speak, or maybe even more than we eat? Listen. And I don't know about you, but sometimes even when I'm quiet, I'm not listening in a conversation. I'm thinking of what I'm going to say next. Good hearing leads to good speaking, or maybe not speaking at all sometimes. Because for Mark and for Jesus and for the man he healed, the ear is the channel to the heart. When Jesus put his fingers in the deaf man's ear and touched his tongue with divine spit, that's a strange little bit in the story, but saliva, bodily fluids at the time of Jesus were considered to be very potent. So he touches the deaf man's ear, he touches his tongue with saliva, and he commands, "Be opened." And the man not only hears in the text, but he speaks plainly. And that's a very interesting word in Mark. The word for plainly in Greek is orthos, orthos, from which we get the word orthodoxy, plain speech, true speech. And don't we wish that all theological orthodoxy did speak plainly and wasn't as confusing as we sometimes find it is? Good hearing leads to good speaking. When you next sing, How Great Thou Art, a hymn that I think everybody's church sings and loves, notice how often hearing is mentioned. It leads in How Great Thou Art to praise. 4th century Prudentius, an early Christian, wrote a hymn about this Markan text that is today's gospel text. And here's one of the stanzas. Deafened ears of sounds unconscious, every passage blocked and closed, at the word of Christ responding, all the portals opened wide, not just the ear, but all the portals opened wide. Hear with joy friendly voices and softly whispered speech. Every sickness now surrenders, every listlessness departs. Tongues long bound by chains of silence are unloosed and speak aright. It's a wonderful gloss on this, this story that we have in Mark today. When we listen with open, healed ears, what we will hear is the sound of God that leads to proper speech, which is always praise of God. When Jesus touches our ears, we discover that the whole universe is singing a great song of praise to God. You remember that the prophecy of Isaiah begins, "Hear, O heavens, and listen, O earth. Hear, O heavens, and listen, O earth." Isaiah announces that when the Messiah comes, the ears of the deaf will be unstopped, and the tongues of the dumb will sing for joy. Some of you know that these phrases are the high points of the recitative section of the Christmas part of Handel's Messiah. Then will the ears of the dumb be opened and the tongue of the deaf unstopped. Beautiful music. It may not be a frequently remembered text when we list the miracles of Jesus, but today's gospel miracle, I think, is a crucially important one for us. Jesus touches the ears of a deaf man and he commands be opened, and the channel of the heart is opened as well as the ears, because the command is not just to the ears, but to the whole person. I think in the world you and I live in, this is a challenge to us not to barricade ourselves in noise, and especially not in noise of our own making, but to risk listening, to risk taking God's world and God's people into our own hearts. Brother David Stendelras, the Benedictine who is so important to so many of us, wrote the following: "A listening heart recognizes in the throbbing reality pulsating against all our senses, the heartbeat of the divine life of all that is real. A listening heart recognizes in the throbbing of reality pulsating against all our senses, the heartbeat of the divine life at the core of all that is real." That's Brother David. In the beginning, the word came from silence and it spoke everything into being. And in the fullness of time, the word became flesh and spoke the gospel to those with ears to hear. And it opened the ears of those who couldn't hear. be opened, Jesus commands our ears. And let your ears take your heart home to God.